Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, Episode 16 for the week ending August 5th, 2016. In this episode, my cohort Jay Rosen and I take on several different topics. The first is the FinCen initiative around beneficial ownership of certain real estate, their expansion of their program of investigation from New York and Miami to include cities such as Houston and Los Angeles. Jay and I discussed this in the context of the U.S. government's overall fight against corruption across the globe. Certainly ties into the 1MDB forfeiture actions. I talk about that. I use that as a jumping off point to talk about the New York Times and Financial Times op-ed pieces about the U.S. government's role in the worldwide fight against corruption and how the U.S. is really the leader of this. Jay uses this to talk about the recent or earlier this spring webinar by Bureau van Dijk around its financial information and data that's available, and he will have a link to that webinar that had Bill Hauserman and Mike Volkov. I talk about a case out of New York where employees were terminated for failure to cooperate during internal investigation and what that may mean under the Yates memo. Jay talks about how e-discovery tools are making their way into compliance programs to help do prevent and detect. I talk about the excellent piece by Matthew Stephenson on the Global Anti-Corruption blog, which looked at the J.P. Morgan Sons and Daughters Enforcement Action and provides an analytical framework to analyze such cases. Then I end up with a few words about my upcoming podcast and blog series on the 10 hallmarks of an effective compliance program. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA for the week ending August 5th, 2016. As always, I am joined by my cohort in crime, Mr. Translations himself, Jay Rosen. Jay, good morning.
Good morning, Tom. I'm prepared. 65 degrees, nice overcast morning, very quiet house. Millie and Michaela are at a sleepover, and Mrs. Sales Enablement is snoozing next door with Latka the Wonder Dog. So all is right in my world.
Well, we're having a little bit earlier session. This is starting at 8:30 Central Daylight Time, which of course means 6:30 Pacific Daylight Time. And the reason we're doing this is a very Los Angeles reason. Jay has a meeting, a morning meeting, and with LA traffic, he had to double down on his blab time so he could get through it. So I found that extremely humorous and one more reason not to live in Los Angeles. But Jay, we had, as you said, we're in sort of the dog days of summer, yet we had some pretty good things to chat about this week. So you want to just get right into it?
Yeah, let's do it.
So you want to start off?
Yeah, I will start off with, let's do FinCen. That over the last couple weeks, there's been all this, I guess, looking into cash purchases of real estate. And I think some of this was brought about by the 1MDB matter. But right. FinCen has released some new geographic areas that, besides looking at before Los Angeles and the New York area, they are now looking at other regions where cash purchases of housing could potentially ring out with some red flags. So, again, this is kind of going back to what we're always looking about for internal controls. And I guess, was it the end of last week that which bank got implicated in this now?
Goldman, I think.
Goldman. So again, we're really, it just kind of boggles the mind that we take more and more steps. There's more things that you can look at from a metrics perspective on, where there is a potential problem. And this FinCen thing, I think, really highlights beneficial ownership. And besides posting this article from the FCPA blog in the weekend read and the show notes, it also reminded me to give a shout out to our friends at Bureau van Dijk a couple months ago. they put together a really good webcast with Mike Volkov and Bill Hauserman, really looking at the tools that are out there to check beneficial ownership. So I'm also going to put a link into the replay of that webinar. But that was one of the things that really seemed to, make some news this week.
Well, let me step back, because this has actually been an ongoing matter, and the one MDB scandal for the Malaysian sovereign wealth fund that we referenced, and the forfeiture lawsuits really tie into, I think, a greater effort by the U.S. government. This FinCen initiative started actually in the spring, and they announced they were looking at cash real estate purchases in New York and Miami. The announcement this week expanded that to, I think, Los Angeles, certainly Houston, and perhaps some other cities. And the original announcement and this expansion really pointed to a gap in money laundering availability in the United States, which is if someone comes in and wants to make a cash purchase for a home or real estate, typically there are not a lot of questions asked about where that money came from. And the one MDB forfeiture lawsuits really highlighted those problems. The Justice Department highlighted it in the complaints, where they talked about the purchases made by not only the son of the Malaysian prime minister, but close family members, and how monies that was allegedly routed out, I should say, from the Malaysian sovereign wealth fund to private shell holding companies, privately owned holding companies, multiplicity of them, and then used to purchase real estate, really prime real estate across the United States. It's going to be very, very interesting to watch this, and this is certainly a very good development for the anti-money laundering efforts by the U.S. government. So we're going to have to see where that goes. That really ties into the sort of next point I wanted to raise, Jay. And I was very interested that on consecutive days, the Financial Times of London and the New York Times actually wrote short op-ed pieces on their editorial pages about the role of the U.S. government in the worldwide fight against corruption. And that really the United States, this is not something new. I think everyone has recognized that the U.S. is the worldwide leader in this, but that only the U.S. government would actually file a forfeiture lawsuit, not only against theft of monies from the Malaysian sovereign wealth fund, but in everything but name the players, up to and including the Malaysian prime minister. And it really shows the U.S.'s dedication to fighting corruption on a global scale. Obviously, in our world, the FCPA is a part of that fight. It's a very important part of the fight, and it's a part of the fight that focuses on corporations and the corporate responsibility for bribery and corruption. It doesn't focus on the bribe receiver or the fruits of their poison tree, such as real estate. So if you think about it in a sort of a continuum of steps to fight corruption, this FinCen initiative fits right in with the forfeiture lawsuit. It fits right in with the FCPA's focus on corporations. And as the government pushes these recovery efforts in the form of lawsuits or in the form of prosecutions under the FCPA, what I see is a business response, a commercial response, a response by ordinary citizens, a response by people to actually implement processes and procedures, or maybe even call them internal controls, to prevent bribery and corruption. And so if you take a step back and look at this in the broader picture and broader context of the global fight against corruption, I find it to be a very significant step, but it's one step, and it's one of many steps that the U.S. government has taken the lead on. And I think that when the New York Times and the Financial Times of London acknowledge that it's the U.S. government's role to take these steps, I think it's a pretty powerful statement. So I was intrigued by that. Certainly intrigued by the points you raised. In our world, everybody kind of slots in with a tool or a service in this fight, and certainly Bureau van Dijk has a tool and a service. Your translations are part of the services. My advising and consulting is part of the services. Red Flag Group is part of the services. But it's really interesting for me to see the business response to this worldwide fight and how, as you said, Bureau van Dijk, which people may not have thought of as a part of an AML type program, may slot right in because of the services they provide.
Yep. So it's interesting stuff and definitely bears watching. Where do you want to go next?
Well, you want to talk about this New York decision? Number 3?
Number 3.
That employees must cooperate in probes.
Oh, yeah. Well, we need a lawyer to talk about that. So
Okay.
I wanted you to handle that one.
Yeah, there was a decision from a New York court where 2 employees, I think from Marsh, but it perhaps was another company.
No, it was Marsh.
Marsh were terminated because they refused to cooperate in an internal investigation. And the court upheld that termination. And the headline, I think it was in Corporate Counsel, but it may have been another magazine, was it's clear now that employees must cooperate in probes. Well, first of all, I think that the court got it wrong. That's not what the law says. And now in the regressive and retro state of Texas it is. But in more enlightened places across the country, I don't think you can be terminated for exercising a constitutional right not to talk. So perhaps you can. But think about that from the context of the FCPA world. This really puts employees in a position where you either cooperate or you're terminated. And if you cooperate and you either don't tell the truth, i.e. lie, or you somehow don't give all the facts, that could certainly open you up to a federal prosecution if that information is just then turned over to the government, as it would be in the context of what's happened after the Yates memo and FCPA investigations. So to put employees on the horns of a dilemma of losing their job or losing their freedom, I really think could take us down a path that we haven't thought through and haven't considered. Now, what happens when an employee says, I'll cooperate, but I'm going to have counsel? Is that going to be a terminable offense? Conversely, what happens if a company says, we will provide you counsel, and that counsel advises the employee not to answer certain questions? Is that now a terminable offense? So lots of questions from this decision. And I think it really points up some of the difficulties we're going to have in investigations going forward under the auspices of the Yates memo, where individuals must be targeted and that information turned over to the government, as is, we now have found out, being done with what's called Yates binders. And I'm sure Merrill Brink will be coming out with a special translation edition for Yates binders. You may even have a Yates binders offering. So it would seem to be something that everyone is going to have to do going forward, at least under the Yates memo.
Now, does some of this go back to the confusion that when the Yates memo originally came out, that they were saying that this places an unfair burden on your chief compliance officer because they may get sucked into some type of investigation and they may get fined? Remember, there was a little bit of a hubbub about that.
I never really put much stock in that, so it's difficult for me to say that that's was something that should have been seriously considered then, and we have seen no evidence of it now. We have not seen, and let me repeat that, because we have not seen in the anti-corruption context any chief compliance officer prosecuted who is not an active part of the bribery scheme. That means nobody's gone to jail for being negligent. The SEC has not prosecuted a chief compliance officer individually for being negligent. We have seen that in the financial services industry because they have a different set of regulations, although they're both regulated by the SEC. We haven't seen that yet in the anti-corruption world. So I really don't put too much stock in that, but I find this decision raises a lot of troubling questions. I don't know where it's going to go. we'll just have to wait and monitor this one.
So one more question for your crystal ball. Do you foresee any significant individual prosecutions and matters coming up in the second half of the year? Do you think that's something that DOJ is kind of timing out, and that would be an appropriate next step to show, that the new regulations have teeth and they're working?
Well, at some point, if they want to show that, they're going to have to do that. Where that comes out on the timing, not having been a federal prosecutor, I really don't know the length of time that process might take. We did have with Acme Technology.
Let's just call it the A company, because I keep hearing so many different pronunciations.
And Nortec, we saw resolutions of their FCPA investigations and enforcement actions in less than 18 months, just a little over 15 months. So the things have sped up quite a bit, but the length of time it would take to prosecute an individual, go to the grand jury, get an indictment. If it's the SEC, send them a Wells letter, give them the opportunity to respond, take that up the chain, consider the arguments. I don't know if this year would be realistic or not, but I really don't know how long that process takes. So maybe it is realistic.
All right. Well, it definitely bears watching too. I think that's the next step in the chain that we need to see to kind of complete the program and its reach. Okay. Let me do one more piece of technology thing. There was a piece that I picked up earlier this week. There is a e-discovery company called Catalyst Repository, and they have been around for the last several years, very thick in a lot of e-discovery matters, just not necessarily FCPA, but some FCPA. Basically, we've always talked about that there are different pieces of technology that are available to people out there, whether it's some kind of offering from Red Flag about how to check people's references. But the point of this article, it was written by John Tredenik, who's the CEO of Catalyst, and he kind of posited that you could use similar e-discovery technology as a proactive way to take a look at your anti-corruption program and to really show adherence and that you're following some of the hallmarks set forth by the latest FCPA pilot program. And one of the things that e-discovery really takes into effect is something called early case assessment. And basically what you're doing is you're taking a look at a subset of data, and then you're training a computer to look for that data. And if it's able to establish that pattern, it may cut out as much as 90% of the data that you need to analyze to get to your seed set. So what John is positing is that if you've got e-discovery in place across your organization, that you might have somebody in Hong Kong and somebody in New York and somebody in Paris searching the same data. And if they're able to come up with any patterns, you might be able to, take care of some issues before they see the light of day. So I think it's another interesting play on that. We see certain technology players in the FCPA, the anti-corruption, the anti-bribery space. And this is basically saying, look, we've already had this technology. We've used it for a long time in the discovery phase of cases. And it might be a case where we have the data already, but we just need to start looking at it from a different perspective and use it as a way to look for problems.
So in the article, did they give any examples of data that people might look at?
Not an example per se, but it was more just kind of like a hypothetical that you've got a lot of data across a company. So let's call that the big data that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And that if you put it on this platform, any discovery platform, you can do Boolean searches, and you could say, Let me see a transaction that falls under a certain limit that happened within a certain time period. So it's just a better way to search that data, but you could simultaneously have different searches going on in different business jurisdictions. And then if a pattern came up, then you could use that as a red flag and start investigating.
What if you have disparate data systems within your company? So for instance, you might have SAP for your financial reporting platform. You might have Microsoft Outlook for your email system. You might have a gifts, travel, and entertainment or employee expense reimbursement system by another vendor. How would you cut across those disparate data sources, or would you have to either import that data into the e-discovery tool or somehow put the e-discovery tool algorithm on each one of those disparate data sources, data systems?
The way I would see it is the former, that you would import all the data into the e-discovery tool. And the e-discovery tool is basically, for all intents and purposes, a search engine. So it's just allowing you to do specific searches on criteria. And, the other thing where a lot of people are starting to use this early case assessment for is, sometimes they feel, well, you're not getting an accurate result. So what happens is you will do manual human discovery, that people will go in and answer binary questions and say responsive or non-responsive. And then what you do is you come back in and you use the e-discovery seed set as basically a check on what you've done humanly. And basically, by doing that, you can kind of validate the e-discovery results. So the thought would be, instead of now waiting after the fact, why not use this stuff proactively and try to look for areas where you might have an issue? And then by doing that, that would really demonstrate the robustness of your compliance, ethics and compliance program.
So who writes, so somebody like me tells somebody like you, here's the query I want to make, you write it, and then you go off, import the data into your tool, run it, and see what comes back?
That's one way. Or, basically a lot of it is self-service. So the people who, there's going to be folks either within the company or within the law firm who are really familiar with running these types of queries and using the e-discovery tools. So I don't think that there's anything proprietary about the tool that does it. It's the thought that this is another way to use technology in a proactive way. It's really an extension of internal controls, I think, and it's just another way to marry those data streams and to be proactive in terms of looking for where there may be the next problem.
Right. Very interesting.
Okay. On your list now.
Yep. So we talked about the Times, Financial Times and New York Times editorial, but Matthew Stephenson had a really interesting post earlier this week about the sons and daughters JP Morgan hiring case, and how the Wall Street Journal has reported that case may be near a resolution. Although Stephenson correctly points out that the Wall Street Journal said the same thing about Walmart last October, and that appears to be no closer to resolution. So, but he came up with a 3-point or 3-question analysis that I think bears reading. So I'm going to go to the glasses here, and he says that a case-by-case analysis of each hiring decision is appropriate and can help to distinguish the thumb-on-scale preferential hiring from gross attempts to offer jobs to relatives as inducements for public officials. He lists his 3 key considerations as: 1, the degree of connection between the job offer and a particular official decision or set of decisions, as opposed to distinct from general goodwill and connections. 2, the degree to which the official indicated that he very much hoped the firm would hire the relative, even if there's not enough evidence of an agreement to establish a quid pro quo. And 3, the degree to which the firm relaxed its ordinary standards to hire the official's employees. I kind of translated that into a little more compliance speak, and using those 3 factors, I came up with these 3 criteria, and I flipped the order. Number 1, does the candidate meet your firm's hiring criteria? Number 2, did the foreign official whose family member you are considering for hire, demand, or even suggest your company hire the candidate? And 3, has the foreign official made or will make a decision that will benefit your organization? In thinking about it more, I thought number 1 could even be, what's the business justification for the hire? Because people are pretty comfortable with thinking about that in terms of bringing on board third parties to the company. And because the business justification for the hire of an employee includes, do they meet your hiring criteria? And so I took that formulation, and went back and looked at the 2 FCPA enforcement actions, Bank of New York Mellon and Qualcomm. And under both of those cases, the candidates did not meet the hiring criteria. The foreign officials involved in the Bank of New York Mellon, it was officials of a state-owned enterprise, a sovereign wealth fund, from an unnamed Middle Eastern country. Both told New York Mellon they wanted their 2 sons and a nephew hired. And then with the foreign official, and in the Qualcomm case, it was Chinese government officials and regulators and employees of state-owned enterprises. And they also indicated that they wanted their sons and daughters hired. And then, has the foreign official made or will make a decision? In Qualcomm, they had made a decision, and they did make decisions in the future. And Qualcomm specifically tied the hiring to decisions that would be upcoming. In the Bank of New York Mellon case, the foreign officials had made decisions benefiting the bank, and actually indicated to the bank that they wanted to continue the relationship. They had to hire the sons and nephews. So applying that to JP Morgan, once again, it appeared the candidates did not meet Morgan's very stringent hiring criteria. What we don't know is, number 2, did the family members suggest or demand that their sons and daughters be hired? And number 3, certainly Morgan, if the Wall Street Journal reporting is right, that they had a spreadsheet which tied the hires to specific contracts, expected the decisions would be made to benefit JP Morgan. So it was a really good, thought-provoking, well-written article by Professor Stephenson, what you've come to expect from Professor Stephenson. And I was able to use it to I wrote a blog post about it as well, and translating it into some compliance speak. So kudos to Professor Stephenson. I think it's a useful way for companies to think through this. I just want to emphasize there's nothing in the FCPA that prevents you from hiring son or daughter or family member of a foreign government official. Just recognize it's high risk and manage that risk appropriately. So
it would be fair to say in this case, for JP Morgan, it was not a good choice for them to document, because that document became the smoking gun, correct?
I do a lot of FCPA training, and I always remind people that if you're going to violate the FCPA, do not put it in a spreadsheet. A special hiring program for sons and daughters of foreign government officials, so that we can track the contracts they send us based upon your hire. So
well, how else are you going to figure out the ROI? You need a spreadsheet if you're going to get ROI.
Yeah, where's e-discovery when you needed it?
Yeah. So let me tee you up for something. Tom has a real interesting series that he's going to kick off over the next couple weeks, taking a look at the 10 hallmarks of an effective ethics and compliance program. So do you want to give a little bit of a preview on that?
Sure. The last 2 weeks of August, I'm going to recap or revisit the 10 hallmarks of an effective compliance program each day on my blog, highlighting the particular prong or hallmark. And then I'm going to do something I've wanted to do for some time, is shorter sort of 10-minute highlights, video podcasts that I'm going to post each day. I wanted to try this. I wanted to cut down the information I provide to even smaller chunks that somebody can listen to it, get a quick recap, and hopefully use that. They can use it within their organization, and something new and something different. And the last 2 weeks of August seemed like to be a good time to do it. So I'm looking forward to that. And we're getting close to the end, and I know you've got to push off to visit, to get on that Guy Clark LA freeway. So what can we look forward to from the weekend wrap up from Mr. Translations?
Well, I think this time I was able to integrate a lot of those pieces into what we discussed this morning. So we're going to take a look at the different technology solutions out there that are available to the ethics and compliance practitioner. We'll have that replay of the Bureau Van Dijk webinar. We'll have the Catalyst piece, and we'll have the FinCen piece. And then I'll also include your two pieces from the New York Times and the Financial Times. So I think it'll be, as somebody said, a nice potpourri of ethics and compliance fragrances for the weekend.
Let me end with a shout out to Doug Cornelius. He's a fellow Homer like yourself, and he is riding in the Pan Mass Bike Challenge this weekend. It's a ride to raise money for cancer. Doug is trying to raise $9,500. He's lost friends and family to cancer, so this is something he's pretty passionate about. I'm used to be passionate about cycling, not so much anymore since I can't do it as well, but I'm supporting Doug. Go to his site, www.compliancebuilding.com, and there's information on it. If you're interested, I would urge you to make a donation to Doug's ride so that we can hopefully continue the fight against cancer.
Great. Any travels coming up for you?
Not next week.
All right. Well, I'm getting ready to jump on the 405 and fight it out. If I'm lucky, maybe I get a little of the Dan Patrick show to help me along my way. And besides that, as always, it's fun to get together Friday morning. And I'll look forward next week to doing this a half hour later. But wish everyone a great weekend. And we'll talk to you next week about the week that was in FCPA.
Great.